Mr. Oliver Patrick.
Oh, awesome.
I start every time with this podcast of, it's the Without Limit podcast. What does Without Limits mean to you? Now, you're a longevity, health and wellbeing expert. So there's probably some different parallels that you're going to draw from here as we talk about Without Limits. But for a life of longevity and health and wellness, what does Without Limits mean?
Oh, it's such a good question. Without limits, I think, to me, again, people get confused as what the purpose of well-being might be, what the purpose of longevity might be. I think there's a very good starting point that looks at happiness as a primary outcome measure of what you are trying to achieve. So what does a life without limits look like? I think it's a life where you're pursuing purposefulness aligned with happiness, and I think it's very difficult to achieve purposefulness, at the expense of happiness. I think some people through history have been able to do it, to put their personal satisfaction aside. But I think in the modern world, that sweet spot between doing something that generates meaningful outcomes to the world while satisfying that inner beast would be a life without limits for me, aligning that sense of purpose and self-gratification and happiness. If you can find that sweet spot, that's pretty good.
That's an awesome answer. How would you define happiness?
It's transient. So it's like many things when people say, how would you define success? It certainly isn't the destination, it's the journey. I think happiness is really about that alignment between, what are my values and what are the actions that I take on a regular basis. I think my life spent trying to help people feel more well is quite interesting, that it's very difficult to get someone to feel well, despite the presence of brilliant behaviors around eating, around nutrition, around sleep, etc., if the actions they take most of the day jar with the very person they are. If I'm a huge people person, I spend my life with numbers, I can do all the kombucha and juicing and sleep I want. At some point, I'll probably realize that I'm not maybe fulfilling my purpose. And again, as a physiologist, I was always keen to say, how could I manage physiology to drive that sense of happiness through neurochemicals? And, if I get your dopamine rocking and rolling and I get your serotonin sky high, you'll be happy, right? And yet I find people who are chemically robust, but dysfunctional. And then you go into the fact that, as a physiologist, you're limited by the fact that we don't yet understand all the reasons that someone would be happy or not. It's a long answer, but I think principally happiness isn't a single point. Happiness is a journey of pursuing, actions and behaviors that fit with your values and reflecting periodically to say, is this the life that I wanted to be leading, or is it a life that's got out of control?
So it's again another brilliant answer. I said to you before we started that we'll be coming at this from a very different lens to maybe some other guests that we've had in the podcast, but looking through that lens of happiness and all the things we're going to come on to talk about, which is, training, movement, nutrition, mindset, recovery. Happiness is often overlooked, and it's sometimes at the expense of some of those other things. So brilliant lens for us to start to look through. You've said a few words there and referred to yourself as a couple of things, a physiologist, a health and wellbeing expert, like we've said. Can you just, for the audience, I guess, dig into what these terms mean? So I know you studied in sort of exercise physiology. What does that mean for the listener?
It means anything is possible, if I can make it out. I did exercise physiology degree with no real vocational outcome for that. It's like it's
like a sports science degree.
Sports science degree, and it's like, well, you can retrain as a PE teacher if you want, or you can, do a master's and go into research. And there was no real world application.
Yeah.
It's a long old story, but I ended up, going into what was called sports physiology. It wasn't, but I was working in health screening, trying to identify whether someone was going to develop cardiovascular disease, and preventative screening and diagnostic screening. So how do I check Ollie to see he's not unwell, and how do I give him a lifestyle plan to stop him ever becoming unwell? And in that process, it became very clear that the skills I had were nearly useful, like really nearly useful. So I knew exercise programming, but I didn't really know how to program for Gen Pop, the average person. I knew how to take someone who was already fit and move them periodized towards some kind of athletic performance, but I didn't know how to communicate to Barbara from accounts who hated PE at school. I knew sports nutrition, but I didn't necessarily completely understand the absence of nutritional literacy that the average person has, that they don't know what a carbohydrate is, they didn't know what fat is, they didn't know, anything about the digestive system. I knew about recovery, but didn't really understand the sleep problem that was encountering. And long story short, I sort of created a training program that backfilled the bits that I hadn't learnt and standardized them, And that became, a qualification called the Level 7 Diploma in Health and Wellbeing Physiology, bit of a mouthful. And I was one of the figures to shape the professional vocation of physiology in the country. And that was through my role as the original head of physiology at Nuffield Health. So I started off really delivering a product that had a gap in it. And then I had to retrofit the skills to that gap and then create a template that meant other people could do the same thing in the same way moving forward. And that enabled me to become, and I do air quotes here for people listening, an expert in the use of data to personalize health strategy. And I went from scaling health assessments up from 10 physiologists to 100 physiologists by the time I left Nuffield, to then co-founding an organization to run the world's most advanced health assessment, where, again, my job was to aggregate data in a multidisciplinary team to try and give someone the best advice possible on whether they were ill or well, and if they were well, how they might be more well, and what that meant to them. So it's a really weird, my centralized skill, which I deploy in different areas, is how do I evaluate status quo in an individual using data and their story, and then how do I use that to improve their quality of life moving forward. And some of the organizations I work on are medical organizations who want more of a lifestyle focus. Some of them are fitness organizations who want more of a clinical approach. And some of them are direct to sort of consumer approach, where I'm speaking relatively technically, but I try and dumb down well-being to the point where people can understand what they have to do today and tomorrow and how that will affect them.
I think the dumbing down a bit is very important, because I think a lot of people choose to bury their head in the sands as it relates to some of these other pieces, particularly recovery, mindset, the environment, and to a large degree, nutrition. I think knowing from firsthand people's experience of trying to live a healthier life and get in shape and feel more confident about themselves, it usually starts with that movement piece. People can resonate with going to the gym, getting off the sofa, going for a run, trying to lose some weight through fitness. And then as they become more aware, they become more conscious, they start to then pay attention to nutrition and what they're consuming. Then they might get to the stage of sort of recovery. I think the mindset piece is overlaid from the very start, from training. I think the mindset begins to build, and you build a more robust understanding of what it takes to actually live a healthy life.
Yep.
And I think then I don't think many people actually get to the point of taking into consideration their environment, their social situation, their circle, external environmental factors, as well as the social being as well.
Spot on.
But we'll talk through all of those. You mentioned the world's most advanced health assessment. I just want to touch on that because there would have been some incredible learnings from that I think might resonate with some of the listeners and people can draw upon. What did that assessment look like? The thing I like so much about you is that you bring objectivity to the table, and we're looking at data. And we'll have a conversation later about the overdependence on data versus how you're actually feeling. And again, we can talk about what you need to be uber aware of those things, which I think first comes from the data, then you can align some behaviors and habits, and then you can sort of like self-regulate. But let's just go back to the world's most advanced health assessment. What does that look like, and what were the learnings from that?
Question. Self-labeled, by the way. So, and I think
that's how things go.
That is how it goes.
Call yourself whatever you are.
And I think it's still running, and I think it definitely was, and to me, still is. I think what you start with is, what would I do with you if money and time weren't an object? If I wanted to answer three really important questions, is there any chance something could be wrong with you? Right. So we know Steve Jobs died of a pancreatic cancer. That's a crushing shame that one of the most pioneering minds in the world was robbed by a cancer that is difficult to detect but not undetectable. And there's that sense of that some people have something wrong with them that isn't wildly symptomatic. Some people. So if you're a very wealthy individual, you can say, I assume I haven't got pancreatic cancer, but it'd be nice to prove that, right? I assume I haven't got a bulging blood vessel, like an aneurysm that one day might burst in my brain or in my abdomen, but I'd like to prove that's not true. So when you have resources available, you can prove something that's a statistical anomaly doesn't apply to you, because why allow a percentage of risk when I need not? Yeah. So at that high level, you can start to do advanced screening, that you've got to find that tipping point between, am I creating more harm with the screening? So a full body MRI, for example, might reveal more confusing false positives than not having run it at all. I wouldn't want to test something I can't influence, and I wouldn't want to test something that, again, has potential ripples far beyond its value. But on the first point, if I've got unlimited money, prove to me there's nothing wrong with me, right? That's job number one. And so the product aimed to do that using whichever consultant, whichever imaging, whichever product would answer the particular question we had. Second layer, prove to me that I'm not going wrong. Right, so I'm 45 years old, believe it or not. And and the question there is, does my internal physiology, I know my external looks about 23, but does my internal physiology look like 72? Yeah, or realistically, 55? And we're seeing markers like epigenetics coming out. What does that mean? It's, have I aggregated more tissue damage than I might expect for a 45-year-old? Why is that relevant? Well, then all the lifestyle diseases that happen in my 70s might happen to me in my 60s. And if I'm 70 years old biologically, then it's happening now. So I think some degree of what I would call pathophysiological change, which is we don't get ill overnight, right? If I have a heart attack, that's been 40, 50 years in the making. If I develop a symptomatic cancer, from a cellular point of view, that might have been slow burn for a number of, maybe years, maybe months. But the question is, can I look at my physiology and see where it's degrading faster than I'd expect against my chronology, my age, right? And that's then, when I got first into health screening, people said, oh, an ECG, the electrocardiogram you put the leads on, is a preventative test. You say, well, it's not really. It's preventing me dying. It's not preventing my arteries being 85% blocked, which is the point it first identifies a problem. Right. So it's most diagnostic testing looking for disease is looking for it in its witching hour, in the 11th hour of the day, versus looking for it at lunchtime and going, right, we've got some decisions to make in the next 12 hours. Right. So second layer is, how do I identify pre-disease physiology and steer away from it? Third layer is the only one that people are interested in, which is what affects the way I feel. So I can talk to anyone about disease and they go, oh, that's great, really interesting. Next Wednesday, they're like, that ginger chap, I'm not getting up at 5 a.m. to meditate so I don't get Alzheimer's in 40 years' time. It made sense at the time, doesn't make sense now. But I do care about the fact I've got no sex drive. I do care about the fact that I am, aesthetically not what I want to look like. I get annoyed that I burp and fart all the time. I get annoyed that, I get the bug that goes around the office and no one else gets. So functionality and feeling is the catalyst for most people's incentive to change behavior. Now, the beauty there again is I can look at data that contributes to that. And there's not one piece of data that says there's your energy. There's not one piece of data that says there's your immunity. But if you take what has been sort of born out of functional medicine isn't looking at whether I have disease or not. It's looking at systems of my biology and going, do they work very well or not? For example, does my digestive system work between 100 being perfect and minus 100 being gross dysfunction? If I work at 20, is there an opportunity to move that to 40? And what would that look like for my bloating and my farting? So the third area is what data would contribute to the way I feel and function. And then what's a logical way of improving that data and seeing whether I feel better? So that health assessment really tried to break those things down and let's do a massive data aggregation and then sit with you, Ollie, and go, right, you told me this was the benefit in life you're after. What data then is going to inhibit that? Which data is going to support that? And if we had to make 2 strategic lifestyle changes, what would they be? And if we had to make one early medical intervention, what would it be? And then how do we curate that over a 12-month period so we don't create a brilliant strategy and then abandon you? So the tail of the product was as important as to the strategy. And it's a very clever product that, again, for people who can afford it, there's sort of like, why wouldn't you do that? Where the learning from that was for me is how much of that data set across those 3 areas was fundamentally a ripple effect from lifestyle. Right? So let's say I've got all this diagnostic data about screening. I've got all this pre-disease data, epigenetics and vascular stiffness. And I've got this feeling data, gut microbiome, all sorts of technical funky stuff. And then I take someone who's inactive and I make them active. What happens to those 3 sets of data? Well, they all improve. They all improve. And then what happens if I improve that person's nutrition from, undernourished to better nourished? Let's say more diverse fruit and vegetables, more consistency of fiber. They almost all improve. Whereas if you take someone who doesn't sleep well or have a good relationship with sleep, and now you get them sleeping better, they all improve. And when you start to look at physiology, it's really interesting as to whether a result you're measuring is a causative result or a reflective result. Right? So if I take something simple like blood pressure, is blood pressure something I'm measuring to measure blood pressure, or am I measuring the effect of sleep, stress, exercise, weight, salt intake? So in many ways, how often are we seeing the problem called a problem, whereas it's just a symptom? Great example, that would be fatigue, right? So how people, I've got fatigue. Well, your body then isn't restoring enough energy. So let's not treat the fatigue, because I can treat that with caffeine. Let's treat where it comes from. And what became really obvious is medicine is again, culturally and technically and understandably managing these symptoms that people are presenting. And how often is the root cause of those symptoms dysfunctional lifestyle? Particularly when DNA became more easily accessible, and we saw, well, the reason for those symptoms isn't genetic. So it's predominantly lifestyle orientated. So I'm like, well, why don't I then continue to focus on improving the quality of lifestyle and decreasing how many of those symptoms end up in the medical system?
How does the everyday person get access to that kind of data? Is it a case of you've now got a pool of data where you can put people into sort of cohorts of typical lifestyle factors, the lives they might have been living, and then begin to trickle that down into the everyday person and see some commonalities that then you can use with them? Or what health screening would be available to someone like myself, or someone who doesn't have all the money in the world to go through the world's greatest health assessment?
So not you then, someone else.
Not me. Not yet.
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to that. First thing is, what I don't want is someone going into a doctor's office with fatigue who goes to bed, jacked on 300 milligrams of caffeine from a pre-workout and did a high intensity interval training 30 minutes before they went to bed, and then took food in, then watched their blue light. What are we doing? What do you expect the doctor to do? Right? The cause of your problem isn't what I'd call pathological. It's not disease. It's a reflection of a lifestyle behavior. So I'm always interested, before we go screening, what are you doing from a lifestyle perspective that's going to show up? Right? Someone who is overweight and has a huge amount of body fat and has a diet high in glucose and smokes, goes to a doctor's office, the doctor can take away the symptom of maybe high glucose and early diabetes and high blood pressure. But until they address those factors, it's going to pop up somewhere else. So I like to say, well, am I moving well, nourishing well, recovering well? Am I, dealing with the way I filter the world through my mindset well? And is my environment conducive to being well? And if all those things are in place, and I'm still presenting symptoms, then I've got a nice situation to not necessarily access health screening, but to go to a physician and say, this isn't being caused by lifestyle. What's the cause of it? From what should the average person do? From a data point of view, your best source of health screening will still be you changing against you. So, what's likely in your bracket would be testicular cancer. So, are you checking your testicles on a monthly basis after a warm bath? Probably not. So why would I wait 2 years for an ultrasound from a doctor who's never seen my testicles before, unless we went to college together? Fundamentally, what's he benchmarking against? My change against me is relevant. My mole change against my previous mole is relevant. My urine frequency against my previous urine frequency is relevant. So layering it up, I say, is my lifestyle robust, or am I just measuring a symptom of dysfunctional lifestyle? Then secondly, am I changing against me as a benchmark in terms of shape of a piece of anatomy or a piece of functionality, which is changing when nothing else has changed, right? So it's not like I've moved to Dubai and suddenly I'm peeing 15 times a day, different climate, different drinking habits. I've gone through, autumn to winter and my urine frequency has gone up by 50%. I'd like someone to explain why that is. The third layer is, what can I measure, which science has brought to me, that is relatively accessible and cost effective. And, certainly within blood work, there's some circulating factors that present no symptoms until down the line. If you've got super high blood lipids, cholesterols and derivatives of cholesterol, then knowing that early in your life cycle is completely logical and can be managed through, yes, partially lifestyle, but also some nutritional adjuncts and then down the line medication. So blood panel, with lipids, a blood panel, making sure glucose control is optimized is absolutely logical, and some basic, tumor markers, that's absolutely robust, and a blood pressure, which again, I don't know till I know. Beyond that, the real question is resource. But I'd say, if most people are focusing aggressively on making their lifestyle as clean as it can across those 5 domains, are checking themselves against themselves, running bloods and a blood pressure, again, on an annual, or biannual basis, you've got most of the data covered. And then it's that reaction to symptoms, not dismissing that as, oh, I'm getting older, or it's, if something changes outside of that framework, I'd like a medical professional to tell me why that's changed, rather than I justify it as it's aging or it's stress or whatever.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. I think I mentioned to you before we started, as someone who's, a wannabe athlete still, a coach, and someone who is aging, it's important for me on all 3 of those lenses to to look at those foundations. And I think a lot of people, we said, focus on training being the first thing.
Yeah.
Then they might get to the nutrition stage. Yeah. We might be lucky that they get to the other pieces of the puzzle, or they jump straight into trying to go to some sort of assessment or blood work, etc. Yeah. So we'll come back to those 5 pillars or the 5 domains that you talk about as being lifestyle elements. So movement, nutrition or nourishment, environmental, mindset, and recovery. Yep. How does someone, that next level up, how does someone become aware that they're in a particular stage of their life, their chronological age, and the sorts of things that they should be looking out for? Because you mentioned testicular cancer, someone in sort of the bracket of life that I'm in. Whilst you've made it now, I'm now conscious of it because you've said it.
Yes.
It's not as readily available to me. I don't think, if you're not looking for it.
No.
And the idea of checking my testicles after a warm bath, I mean, one, I don't have warm baths, I have showers, but it just never crosses my mind.
No.
So what should we be doing to try and be more aware of those things, or what can the world be doing to try and help us be more aware?
I think that piece of personal health management almost sits as a sixth layer, which is sort of, there's a great fallacy that it's someone else's job for you to be healthy.
Such a good point.
It's your job, right? And because no one called you in for a testicular examination doesn't mean you shouldn't be checking your testes. Because you didn't get drawn into a national mole screening program doesn't mean you haven't got to check that. The mole that looks like Africa has suddenly turned into a whole continent on your back. And, because you aren't getting shortness of breath doesn't mean, an ECG or equivalent wouldn't be worthwhile. So I think one of the great challenges is I am the biggest component or proponent and fan of the NHS ever, because it's an unbelievable system, but it's a reactive healthcare system. It's there when you get, heaven forbid, bumped in a car crash, or, you get a knee injury playing rugby, or it will bring you back to a state of non-dysfunctional. But it isn't its job to find disease before it's symptomatic. Yeah. And it isn't its job to shape your lifestyle to avoid the disease developing in the first place. It's your job. Now, where's a centralized resource for that? I don't know where it is, truth be told. And I think part of some of what I'm doing at Future Practice is trying to work out how I create a toolkit that says, right, Ollie, here's your framework that says, right, I do want you to check this on an annual basis. I want you to check that every 2 months. And by the way, here's a signpost to, testicular examination video. Here's a signpost to where you check your mole out. Because you don't want to create, hypochondriacs on every street corner, but you say, if someone is doing those things on a periodic basis, that is more effective than an ad hoc medical-led screening approach.
Well, I think the reality as well is that we're losing the battle, right? Like massively, as individuals. And you make a perfect point. We need to take more ownership of it ourselves.
Yep.
I know myself in that sense, like those 5 pillars, I'm doing pretty well.
Yes.
But I'm not covering some of those other areas, particularly as I'm getting a little bit older and maybe more susceptible to those things.
I think that there's that mortality piece. And again, you're a dad, and there is a hinging point that you're immortal till you're not, right? And that's quite a useful design mechanism that says we're not continually fixated on the fact we are all going to die. Now, some people, that mechanism is broken a little bit, and that's a very difficult life. I remember, I think the film Krull, which is probably before your time, but a classic 80s fare, and it's the Cyclops, and so why does the Cyclops walk the world alone? He's sort of this miserable, one-eyed creature. It's like, because he knows the exact moment of his own death. So he can't get past it. He knows he's going to die, and he spends his whole life worrying about it. So we're programmed to not focus on that, which is absolutely logical. So it's a difficult thing to incentivize outside of, you and I both know motivation is secondary to habit formation.
Yeah.
In terms of I can't be motivated to check my testicles once a month. It doesn't work. I've got to have that habitually embedded into my routines. I think, the sort of the modern day toolkit that says, right, Ollie, you're now, into mid-30s. These are things you now need to do on this frequency. I don't see a centralized resource that really covers that off. And it sort of goes to the bones that it's never been anyone's job, particularly to give you that toolkit. I mean, the NHS has got some incredible resources, but it wouldn't necessarily say, Ollie, there's your health strategy for this year, which is I want 1 blood test, two testicle checks, 1 maybe check of the rhythm of your heart, and then off you go. And it's got to be very careful. It doesn't set a precedent of resource it cannot in any way, shape or form match. So I think, if I go to testicular cancer, there'll be a sheet there how to do it. If I go to bowel cancer, it'll tell me there about how I can crap in a bucket, and they'll check for blood. And, there's all these different ways, but they're the great challenge of health, and to a certain extent, fitness and well-being, is its ability to divide into these subsections that don't make any sense. I'm not going to go to 15 different pages to work out what this Ollie needs. I need one page that goes, right, you're 45 years old, this is what your 12-month landscape should look like. And I think I see a role in the future of the fitness industry to become a sort of curator of that strategy. And again, work you're already doing and when we talk about is creating that lifestyle piece. And this personal health management as an adjunct to that, I think fits in quite neatly.
Yeah, the crying shame is that everyone is on autopilot, and to slow down and think about these things and to think about yourself, really critically.
Yes.
And how you're feeling, and when the last time you checked in with yourself both physically and mentally, it's just not there for a lot of people, which we'll probably come on to talk about future practice and the work you're doing there, and whether that is something that, because lots of personal trainers and coaches will listen to this, whether that is something that they can take more ownership of and make themselves a much more valuable asset to the people they coach. But let's dive into those 5 domains of lifestyle factors. This will resonate with everyone. The first one being movement, so essentially training.
Yeah.
Are there any nuggets or things that we should be thinking about? Like, I'm someone that trains a lot, potentially too much sometimes. What's the
not according to my wife.
You're giving me a look there. What would be the most is there a most optimal for someone to train that's looking for, again, we need to look at this through the lens of like longevity. If I'm looking for a well-rounded life for years to come, not right now. A lot of people listening are probably in their late 20s, early 30s. Body can still just about cash the checks that the mind's asking it to. But when we're not in the moment and we're getting slightly older, can we still recreate, that athletic being 10, 15 years down the line? What should we be thinking about?
Great question. And again, from a training point of view, you will be far superior to I. What I am interested in is the biological degradation of aging, right? So if I look at me versus you, what am I facing as a challenge? I will have multiple years more of my body trying to waste away my muscle mass. Right, so
it's actively trying to waste it away.
Actively trying. So we have a very clear life cycle. In fact, we go through adolescence and we mature and then maturation, and then we basically are given this incredible window of opportunity to mate, reproduce, and then sort of wither off into the distance with gradually diminishing resources. I mean, it's cheery as fuck, But that hinging point is about 35 for most people, and people used to call this middle age spread, or a friend of mine pulled his hammy at the school sports day, unleashing a 60-meter sprint, dad's race, and it's like a sniper picked him off midway through, just comedy gold. But, we lose mass, we lose speed, and this all sort of hinges somewhere in that, late 20s, maybe early 40s, because our body has given us the chance to reproduce, and then the resources that were required for that stage of life cannot be sustained ongoing. Right? So what would be the difference between me at 45 and my dad at 80, for example? Well, he will have significantly reduced muscle mass, and that's because muscle, for all its beauty, is an active tissue, always demanding calorie consumption, and calorie consumption creates waste products called free radicals that break me down. So it's a self-protective mechanism that the less muscle tissue I have, the less calories I require, the less tissue damage I will incur. So I actually protect myself by having less muscle mass, but it comes at additional costs because my body wants to live to 80, that we've got this juxtaposition between modern medicine and the way that the body was designed to be. But that age-related loss of muscle mass called sarcopenia is a fascinating window of opportunity for the fitness profession. Because if you go and look at, Brian Johnson, who's doing the longevity project on himself in America, or you go to an Uber longevity center.
Brian Johnson for people that...
Yes, he's a tech billionaire who sort of decided to take this concept of biohacking. How can I adjust every single biological system that would deteriorate with aging? How can I interfere with that in the most technologically enabled way possible to reverse aging? So he ran a biological test of aging, and there's 3 main ones, but one's called epigenetics, where you look at the volume of damage that has been inflicted on your DNA. And he's basically running every possible thing you can think of that's been proven to reverse cell damage or prolong longevity. And he's running it on himself as this incubated experiment. So the guy lives in a sort of, the air quality in his house is so controlled, he doesn't go outside much. He is relentlessly on some big medications, metformin, which is a diabetes medication, rapamycin, which is a sort of an immune modulating medication. He's on testosterone to offset all the things that go wrong. And it's a bit like that example. Look at my blood work at 45, look at my dad's at 83. Everything that's less, he's taking something to top him up. And his epigenetic age has gone down. since he began this program, and he's sort of being cited as the poster boy of longevity and anti-aging. But if you look at his schedule, and he's produced, so he's called it the blueprint, and he's made that publicly available. So, he's made his money. He's basically saying, this is what you can do if you're prepared to live in an airtight bubble with, £1 million a year. But the biggest piece of that longevity program is his fastidious, relationship with weight training.
Yeah.
Muscle mass is the anti-aging rock star, right? Unequivocally. So not just the role of muscle in enabling movement, which is critical, sustaining bone mass, which is critical, but its production, its contribution to production of positive hormones, its ability to mop up blood glucose. So you'll see, what everyone is fixated on as we get older is our inability to stop the sugar in our blood rising. And so everyone's taking drugs like metformin or wearing continuous glucose monitors. Well, put an extra kilogram of muscle on and walk an extra 2,000 steps and let me see those results, right? So this is where I get frustrated with the movement community, that it underplays its role in the biggest single factor that will change me over the next 20 years of my life, which is loss of muscle. So I don't weight train to compete at high rocks because that's not in my bandwidth, or, I don't weight train particularly for aesthetics because I've reached the point where I don't know if I can do that anymore. I weight train to not lose muscle. So my singular marker of success on my weight training is my lean tissue as determined by, a biannual body composition. Is my muscle mass in terms of kilograms of tissue consistent? And if it's dropping sounds disgusting. If it's falling off, I need more weight training. If it's stable, the weight training is equivocal to purpose. And I'll come back to that reference because that's relevant to the other pieces. But I think 3 things are happening to me as I age. I'm losing muscle mass for very logical reasons, but I don't want to. I'm losing cardiovascular capacity, my ability to consume oxygen, which we could definably measure through a figure like VO2 max, which we might touch on later. But I can measure our aerobic capacity, which will translate to who would run the faster 10K out of you and me. Yeah. But also, if it was lower, would define who of us is going to survive surgery if we have to go in under a general anesthetic. And it's the single best marker of how long both of us will live. Single best marker.
VO2 max.
VO2 max. But because we sit here now, we're consuming and combusting oxygen. That's how we work. So VO2 max translates to athletic performance, but it's fundamentally the core working of human physiology. And then my robustness of range of motion and quality of motion will deteriorate inevitably with decreased pliability of my muscles, decreased flexibility. And that will make me more predisposed to injury, to sort of biomechanical dysfunction. So just on a basic level, if I take me, my dad, what's less? He's got less muscle mass, got lower VO2 max, got less range of motion, quality of motion, mobility. So what is my approach to well-being? What is the minimum dosage required to stop the deterioration of those 3 biological systems, right? So forget the athletic outcome, forget the aesthetics. If I take lean tissue, a VO2 max, and some degree of arbitrary movement analytic, when someone says, is my exercise effective? If those 3 markers are stable, your exercise is not just effective, it's anti-aging. If you have a performance objective, we're taking one of those to extreme levels, if you want to do an ultra marathon, etc. That's great, but that's where, you and I've talked off camera before about the offset between performance and well-being. I might take one of those biological systems to extreme at potentially the expense of either another biological system or another domain of lifestyle. So I might push myself up here at the expense of flexibility. Ultramarathon, maybe I lose flexibility and maybe I lose sleep. So from a well-being point of view, is it a net positive or net negative? And sometimes we find, with extreme athletic performance, it's a net negative for well-being because the cost across the collective domains of lifestyle is greater than the benefit of taking one biological system to extreme heights.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. So it's fair to say then what we spoke about, where people start at being movement and training, that would be the right place to start, right? And our intention should be lift weights,
yes,
and the objective markers and data that we can pull, like an in-body machine or something like that.
Yep.
As regularly as you feel you need to, but probably a few times a year to see whether skeletal muscle mass is being maintained or at least growing. If it's not, then it's a case of increasing strength training. Obviously, we need to couple this with consumption of protein and adequate calories.
Hold on.
There's going to get to a stage where people just can't give any more resource, time, effort to training.
Yep.
But I guess that's the stage in which they realize that given the balance of just general well-being on the other pillars, that's kind of where we need to sit. And then we're probably going to be accepting of a decline or being stagnant.
It's either work hard to attenuate the decline or accept the consequences of. But the consequences will be medicated as, so again, I've lost muscle mass, which means I've lost bone mass. So I go on a medication now to increase bone density. So what you'll get is, as that system deteriorates, the ripple effect will be treated as diseases by medicine. So osteopenia, the stop where your bones are getting thin before you get osteoporosis, will be treated with injectables or high dose vitamin D and vitamin K and all these other things, or don't lose the muscle mass in the first place. And low VO2 max, is going to ripple into a million different problems. And so I think data can help you make that decision. Flipping that again, that data is pretty robust, until your mid-30s. So if I'm mid-30s, I might want to see that the training is loading into muscle mass. You will know, again, better than I, that you can be much stronger without your tissue changing through the coordinative capability and what we call the neuromuscular adaptation to fitness. So it's not always a proxy marker. You can get someone who improves enormously from a 10K time and from a reps or load volume without huge anatomical change, because they harness their anatomy to a greater degree. But avoiding that deterioration of underlying anatomy and physiology is a brilliant marker. And flip to that is the separate benefit of physical activity, right? So I can come in and blast myself to pieces, overload those systems of biology and take them to extreme, but I still needed to be active during the rest of the day, because that activity stabilizes my glucose levels again. That activity jiggles stool, crap through my colon or my bowel and helps avoid constipation. That movement helps a continuous flow of oxygen to my brain that helps clarity of thought, So I think there's key bits. First, we have to separate activity from exercise. Activity is the very foundation of being well. It's very difficult to be well in its absence. It's possible, but it's difficult. And then exercise is overwhelming a system of biology to either a performance benefit or a well-being benefit through attenuating its drop-off.
Nice. And is it simple as for the increase in muscle mass? What objective measures besides an in-body scan could we be thinking about increases of 5 RMs, 10 RMs, 3 RMs in certain lifts as a measure of that?
Totally. So you can have a functional expression of it. So you can say, I can measure 10,000 steps, because measuring activity, I could do a continuous glucose monitor and say, what's your glucose level? I can say, if you do 8,000, and of course, we know 10,000 doesn't mean anything, but it's quite a good level of activity. So 10,000 steps, I probably don't need to measure blood glucose, because I know it's in place. If you can do, a 5 rep max on this particular weight, I probably don't need to measure lean tissue, because there's no way you could achieve that in its absence. So you can measure the expression of the physiology, or you can measure the physiology itself. And I think that hybrid approach works quite well. And again, you will know what outcome metrics are of performance, again, better than I. And you could say your high rocks time, to a degree, is a collective outcome metric of that combined physiological. You're not going to get there unless you have good mobility. You're not going to get there without huge cardiovascular capacity. You're not going to get there without great lean tissue. So I don't necessarily need to measure those things while you're expressing them in such a definitive fashion. Where I would be interested in saying, well, again, if I see someone competing at a high level at high rocks, unequivocally they'll have great physiology across those domains. So I'd probably be interested in what lens are they viewing the world through. I'll be interested in their sleep and recovery, because from a well-being point of view, being in the top 5 at high rocks doesn't mean you're happy. And again, not to say, I'm sure it would make me happy, it really would. But that sense of, again, of where we have to look at well-being is a sort of a consistent capability across all the domains, versus taking one domain, i.e. movement, and becoming an absolute rock star at it. Yeah,
having lived it firsthand, sort of back end of my 20s, I think I mentioned to you before, I mentioned on various sort of podcasts and things before, I think training and nutrition I had dialed in, but the recovery piece and just like stress management, a time of coming out of rugby, a bit of identity sort of crisis, moving into the business world, coaching all the hours that God gave me, trying to grow a business, training nutrition was as good as I could have got. I was controlling it to the nth degree, perhaps too much, which was contributing to the stress. But I was both physically and mentally very, very unwell. So the well-being piece was missing. Just to come back to the VO2 max thing, for people just to understand this in simple terms, a simple test like a 5 or 10K, or a 30-minute bike test, or something that can be consistently repeatable. If we're improving our times, we can be confident that we're improving on our VO2 max.
Absolutely right. And I think there's a better marker of fitness than VO2 max. VO2 max is quite measurable, but the point in my increasing exercise intensity when I move from using fat as my primary fuel to using carbohydrate would be a bigger determinant of who's going to kick the sort of 5Ks ass, and who's going to get the 10K's ass. So the person who can run on fat at 85% of their total capacity is going to perform better in most of those tasks. So VO2 max is it has its fallibilities. And again, for those it's the volume of oxygen you can consume in a minute of maximal exercise. That's what VO2 max is defined as, in milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute. So there's no doubt if you took 100 people and you got them to run 10K, the ones who came in 32 minutes and the ones who come in 50 minutes, there'll be a linear relationship between their VO2 max. So if you said we are using that as a proxy marker of your cardiovascular capacity, you're 100% right in doing that.
Yeah, awesome. Let's move into nourishment and nutrition. What are people doing right? What are people doing wrong? There's a very reductionist mindset around nutrition with the whole calories in, calories out. And I guess that's where the majority of society are focusing now, and potentially rightly so, for trying to offset the environment we find ourselves in with readily available sugary foods, processed foods, etc. What are we missing? What should we be thinking more about? And what's your kind of stance on proper nourishment?
Good question. I think, in many cases, it's become overcomplicated to a degree. When you talk about the environment being the biggest factor, in the same way as why are so many people sedentary? It's because our environment forces me to be so. I can get out of the train station and get a cab here. But, if there was no cab there, I would have walked here.
Yeah.
Right. So because there's always there's an escalator, there's an elevator, there's a personal mobility scooter. So we were never designed to be inactive. We were never designed to sit. So whatever we look at, it's the phrase was coined years ago that we live in an obesogenic environment. I'll come back to that, which means everything around me is trying to make me less active and eat foods that have a higher energy density than I'm used to. And again, when we look at nutritional science, we've got to be careful that we're not using it to correct someone's an eating dysfunction or some kind of health condition where we need clinical nutrition. But I'm in the same way as when someone doesn't sleep well, I don't want them to go and see a sleep doctor until they've cleared up their caffeine, cleared up their alcohol, cleared up their patterns and behaviors around sleep. I don't want someone necessarily to see a clinical nutritionist until we've worked out what percentage of their diet is hyperpalatable, ultra processed food.
Yeah.
So in the same way as I'm facing a battle to be more active because everything is against me, I'm facing a battle to be nourished because most of my food has its nourishment removed from it. And that's where this phrase hyperpalatable, ultra-processed food comes from, which is estimated to be about 50% of the UK's diet currently, about 60% in the US. And what that means is, predominantly to make a food hyperpalatable, I've got to take out the stuff that doesn't elicit immediate, palatability, taste, flavor, excitement. And that would be fiber. And to a certain extent, that would be protein. And again, how hard it is to get protein volume in. So you can look at those foods and say, if I take something that grew on God's earth and then I decide to remove fiber and or protein, I will be able to move it into my digestive system quicker, elicit a quicker neurological response, dopamine, maybe others, and I'll create a false feedback loop that says, wow, that's delicious, and B, eat more because I'm not feeling full yet. I find Ozempic a fascinating med, and this is the weight loss medication that I think the fitness industry has got to look at, because if people are joining the gym to get weight loss, they now face a new enemy, which is Ozempic, right? Yeah. Well, I was going to go to the gym and join, but now I can lose 2 stone by injecting myself. Ozempic, fundamentally increases the feeling of feeling full and stabilizes blood glucose, which is what fiber does. Right? So Ozempic is sort of an injection of fiber, an expensive injection. It's more complicated than that, but on principle levels, if I take fiber out of food, I don't have to chew it. And I don't have to chew it, I can get it in quicker and I can get that instant satisfaction. And I can probably eat sideways while I'm picking up my Instagram and picking up the kids from school. So there's no consciousness around my food because I didn't have to chew it. And how many people like brown pasta versus white pasta? You've got to chew it and it makes you feel a bit full. You don't get the same pleasure response. But fundamentally, I like to look at diet and go, where are the key functions of diet? First point is nourishment. Do I get the nutrients from food that I need because I don't make them? So I don't make vitamin C, I don't make vitamin D without the core foundation. I don't make, certain amino acids that I need from protein. So if I don't get those things, I am malnourished. And if I eat a diet that isn't diverse, based largely on whole foods, then it's very difficult for me to be nourished. As a secondary ripple of that, we hear a lot about gut health, and it's very difficult for all these incredible bacteria that live in my gut, which are often the whole collection of my body's bacteria gets this name microbiome. They feed on fiber, and different types of fibers from different foods feed different bacteria that do different jobs. So if I take that that diet that's rich in plant-based foods, lots of different types with lots of different fibers, eaten slowly because they're full of fiber, that solves the nourishment problem, that solves the gut crisis, that will solve certainly an energy density problem because I'll feel fuller quicker and I'll get this feeling of satiety. So I think, again, we've got to separate the well-being community from the performance community who have a higher nutrient demand for B vitamins. They might want to access creatine monohydrate. They might want to access more anti-inflammatory foods, omega-3s, turmerics, vitamin Ds. There's a piece in there. But your average person shouldn't go to some wild and wacky nutritional strategy until they've looked at, can I get more diverse plant-based foods eaten slowly? And if I change those, what's the thing that was bothering me? And does that go away? And if it doesn't go away, then, do I need a deeply personalized nutrient approach? Possibly, then I should consult a professional. But I think, the biggest problem with most people's diet is consumption of foods they didn't realize are malnourishing, falsely contributing to a lacking sense of hunger when they've eaten enough or sufficient calories, what we call the energy density. And, in amongst that, a sort of ripple into gut health, which has repercussions far and wide.
I mean, that's pretty consistent, I think, with the overriding message of the industry. You mentioned a few things there that relate to sort of supplementation. What's your take on supplementation?
I think it's good. I think it's good. I think it's very difficult to be nourished on a whole food diet without buffering, right? You can go to not necessarily conspiracy theories, but you can say, look, there is undoubtedly a change in the way food is being manufactured, turnaround times. What used to happen is, so nutrients in food come from soil predominantly, so plant-based food certainly. If the nutrients aren't in the soil, it won't end up in the fruit, the veg, the other. And there was a study years ago by the Ministry of Agriculture, Farming and Fisheries, MAF, I think is their nice name, and they basically showed that the nutrients in a banana in the 70s was a percentage of the nutrients. So it was I think it was 7 times more nutrients than you got in the late 90s when they ran it. And that's just the fact that if it isn't in the soil, it's not going to end up in the fruit and veg. And the big nutrient that's missing in those scenarios is magnesium. And we're seeing big magnesium shortages functionally in lots of people who, again, don't sleep well or have got increased muscle tension or neurological challenges. But I think a magnesium deficiency from diet is a good example that there's less vitamins in the food that we eat now than there used to be. So it used to be, 5 portions of veg. I probably now need 7, 8, 9 to get the equivocal nutrient value. That's not going to happen in someone who's not leading a sort of vegan, fastidious life. So, right, what do I need that I'm unlikely to get through my food? And that's where a supplement steps in. It doesn't replace my diet, it augments it, adds that layer on top. So what I would occasionally do with clients, you'd run a MyFitnessPal, free resource, look at your diet from a nutrient quality, say, look, that's pretty consistent across a week, 2 weeks. I've noticed there that I'm not brilliant on my B vitamins. I've noticed there I'm not brilliant on vitamin D. I've noticed, how do I backfill that portion from a nourishment perspective and say, those are food groups I just don't eat much of, but I do recognize that nutrient has a valuable role in my body. And a good example, omega-3, right? So omega-3 has a great role cardiovascularly, from a brain health perspective, from a reduction in inflammation. And there we're talking about excessive unwanted inflammation. If I just don't eat much cold water fish, mackerels, sardines, anchovies, then I should just take a supplement because I still need the nutrient, even if I don't like the food. So I think the first thing is where are my nutrient deficiencies that are reflective in my normal pattern of eating? Yes, I should do that through whole food, but I live in the real world. If I can't, then what's a nutrient that I can use to backfill that? And then you're into your domain, performance nutrition, and saying that's a different animal. And there you've got to say certain physiological demands drain on resources more than others. So there is a higher need for protein in someone who's got a huge training volume. There's a higher need potentially for other, again, creatine monohydrate. I might need more for my power output, etc. They're pretty well evidence-based, those two in particular. So for me, it's very difficult to draw a line of best fit. I would say I've met very few people who've got optimal B vitamins, which are fundamental for energy production, optimal magnesium, optimal vitamin D, and optimal omega-3.
Nice. That's what I wanted to hear.
Don't quote me on that.
We have all those products.
That's not recorded, is it?
Let's move on to recovery. This is a big one. It's very topical now. I think the sort of heat and cold exposure is big. Let's try and dispel any myths or even just confirm what people, I guess, think about those things. So ice baths, saunas, anything else? I mean, recovery encapsulates sleep as well, right? So that's probably the biggie that we need to focus on. So is there anything there that we need to be considering? And then what can we add on top of that, layer on top of our sleep from a recovery perspective, whether it's hot and cold therapy, if we don't have access to that, is there anything else that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think recovery is rightly coming to the fore, in terms of, you cite beautifully from your example that you have perfect nutrition, pretty perfect training, and it didn't get you where you wanted to get to from a well-being perspective. And again, we have to separate performance. You might have been performing amazingly, but not feeling fantastic.
Actually, when I reflect back on it, I was thinking to myself, was I undernourished? Because those are the two that I was focusing on. So I was hyper-focused, training really hard and rightly so for a number of reasons, because I've always trained hard, but I was using it as a bit of an outlet.
Yeah.
And then from a nutrition standpoint, I was tracking calories. I was consuming around 3,500 to 4,000 calories. So I didn't feel as though I was undernourished, but I was rapidly losing body weight.
Interesting.
I was very stressed out, very tired. And I was so fixated on those two pillars.
Yeah.
Not really I slept, and I thought I slept well, but not really thinking about anything that was going to raise parasympathetic tone, rest, digest, just like any sort of restorative work. There was, mindfulness and breath work, and all those things weren't a thing back then. Now they are. So what are the key things we should be thinking about from a recovery standpoint?
And that you've picked on some of them there perfectly already. I think, if we take one step back and say, how do we define recovery? It will be very different depending on the setting you find it in, because, Hyperice will tell us recovery is percussion gun, compression trousers, and it's products that drive recovery. Anyone selling you anything to do with sleep will say sleep is recovery. You could argue that the post overwhelm response is inflammation. So reducing excessive inflammation, that's recovery. I think a unifying term could be, recovery is the biological processes that restore energy. So if we call it that, then we've got
trying to gain energy back.
Trying to gain energy back, because the human is a battery. We expend and we recoup, and we just forget that recouping process isn't entirely delivered by sleep, but sleep is the best point within my life cycle to restore energy, but it's not the only point that I can restore energy, nor should it be the only point I restore energy.
I guess that draws into the idea of stress management, as stress taking a lot of our mental energy, because I guess there's different versions of energy, right? Physical, mental, what else is that? Emotional
and spiritual would be the four. So beautifully
put. I'm not very in touch with my spiritual.
Well, I think you might be. And the thing with spiritual is it's a crap name, right? So it's not about faith, it's not about God, but it's about alignment with purpose. So you'll probably find, based on my following you intensely online and knowing you, that your spiritual energy is probably pretty good.
That's an interesting one. Okay, so when you're doing work that isn't giving that fulfillment, you're probably not aligned with the spiritual energy, and that can be draining.
Spot on.
And that leads to frustration.
Enormous. And I think that piece. So energy is an animal within an animal, right? So we could spend the whole time on the non-biological factors contributing to energy, but the biological factors or physical factors are based mostly around sleep, restoration of balancing of nervous systems, we'll come to that in a second, and suppression of excessive inflammation. Because all three of those, and again, let's take a straw man example, someone who doesn't sleep well, who never disengages from being switched onto the world and has got chronic inflammation, I don't need to question that person to know they're going to be tired.
Yeah.
So that's before I work out if they've got good emotional energy, as in they're happily in good relationships, they've got good mental energy, they're being stimulated and growing, or they've got good spiritual energy, they live a life of purpose. If they don't sleep well, and they don't have any physiological ability to restore nervous system balance, we'll talk about that, and they're chronically inflamed, they're going to be dysfunctional. And sometimes you get such high achievers, certainly in the world of looking after, high achievers, they can bully that lack of physical energy for years and build up this sort of chronic debt. And they turn around and go, and this is where we end up with scenarios like burnout. And you can't draw a single cause to burnout, but ignoring physical energy, absence, and just bullying through to the point where your body goes, I'm now going to draw a halt on your activities because you've cashed out, basically.
What does burnout manifest itself as?
So burnout has an occupational health definition, which is it's not one thing, but it fundamentally is the inability to wake. And again, just separating it from chronic fatigue, which is an adjunct to it. So chronic fatigue would be I wake up having slept well, unrefreshed, and a whole multitude of increased activity increases fatigue, whereas normally increased activity increases energy. So there's some patterns to that, and there's many different derivatives within that, from Lyme disease to long COVID to ME, etc. Burnout is defined occupationally as it's really a loss of your joy,
drive for work.
So there's fatigue and lethargy within there. There's lack of cognitive clarity. It's got a sort of 9-point checklist for a diagnostic criteria, but it's defined as an occupational condition, not as a medical condition. So it's not listed as a health condition.
Fine.
So it's very contextual against the setting of the workplace and against the criteria. Most of the things are that inability to find joy.
Yeah.
And again, without being too wild, it's really difficult to distinguish between burnout, fatigue, chronic fatigue, because they cross over so clearly. And my great concern in that area is depression, which has got a diagnostic criteria. One of the main diagnostic criteria of depression is fatigue and loss of physical, appetite to partake in tasks. And so if I go to a doctor with who's got 9 minutes, with 7 minutes to work out what's wrong with me, and I say, I've got no joy in my life, I can't see any opportunity for me, of course, they'd be terrified about me harming myself. They've got to logically put me on something that nips that in the bud. So of course, they would be logical to put me on an antidepressant of some description. And it might have been inadequate physiological recovery that put me into a state where I didn't have the energy to feel motivated. Now, that's not saying all depression is caused by inadequate recovery. In fact, people who infer that do disservice to the genetic and the chemical contribution to the complexity of depression. But there's very few situations where the symptomology of that depression, be it clinical or low grade, wouldn't be improved by having more energy. So to restore energy, 3 key things. Of course, I've got to sleep well. Well, that's my weapon of choice. And sleeping well is not the same as sleeping. So, yes, technical, it should be between 7 and 9 hours. You're an outlier if you get away with great energy restoration on less than that. UK average is 6.2 hours. So
how many do you average, Sam?
3 to 4.
Yeah, and again, at your stage of life. So there's different challenges. So Sam, we know, is aesthetically a young man. I also happen to know how old he is because he shared it with me earlier. There's a resilience you can get away with these things for periods of time, right? And let's also remember, these books of human physiology must not be balanced daily. They're balanced over time.
Yeah.
And when we're in, and if I could borrow some of Sam's blood and inject that into me, in your 20s, you're still, full of stem cells, and you're still full of testosterone. You are physiological opportunity, Sam, no more than you presenting there. I am sort of physiological. I had my day in the sun, and now I'm withering on the vine. So what I once got away with, I can't. And most people will be like, I can't drink like I used to drink. There's no better example. What's happened between me being 22 and believing I can do a day on 17 pints, and then me now terrified of the percentage of the IPA I've been served. Is that 2.5% or above? I can't do it. But what's changed? My physiology just cannot handle the same toxic load. I can't handle the same lack of sleep. So, the behaviors are consistent, but my resilience against them is diminished. So, we don't want to concern anyone. If you don't meet these criteria, you are going to fall off a cliff. But if you are getting inadequate sleep, your body needs to find energy elsewhere, and it might find some of those paths of energy naturally, and it might find some of them unnaturally. So on sleep, again, most people get inadequate sleep in terms of volume. Most people get inadequate sleep in terms of time spent in restorative zones. We don't want to turn this into a full sleep thing, but deep sleep is a really powerful modulator of my immune system. It's a really powerful point of memory consolidation. It's really important for trauma therapy in terms of someone, was mean to me on the train down to Harpenden, and how do I deal with that without creating a trauma that means next time I'm on a train, I'm going to overthink it, etc. A lot of that happens in deep sleep. So it's rock star stuff. And it happens in the early part of the night, which is the part of the night most vulnerable to mismanagement of caffeine dosages, mismanagement or misunderstanding of alcohol as a sleep aid versus a sleep suppressant. So alcohol helps me fall asleep but doesn't help me go into sleep cycles. So that's catastrophic. Mismanagement of light and dark, mismanagement of other. So if I have a lifestyle where, again, I'm using caffeine inappropriately against my ability to buffer caffeine, so anything after lunch is a challenge. I'm using alcohol. I haven't had a hard stop on complex problem solving in the early evening. I haven't done anything that involved play or sensuality. Or, again, not making my house sound like a sort of terrifying place to be. But what's the wind down that says when I go to sleep, I am so free of complex thought that I will allow myself to go to deep sleep where I'm vulnerable. Right? And people who've had kids, you remember when you first have kids, of course you don't sleep well because you're listening for the baby crying. When you set your alarm for 5 o'clock to travel internationally, you wake up at 4:55. Because if you've got to be in the world, you can't be in deep sleep. And people are in the world more than they've ever been, plus minus these substances being misused, plus minus blue light. So we got a catastrophic environment for good sleep, where again, if my sedentary behavior is being driven by my environment, my nutritional behavior is being driven by my environment, sleep is another environmental nightmare. And the new phrase now being coined is an anxiogenic environment, which is my environment is now creating heightened anxiety by forcing me to be perpetually ready for some kind of something to go down that may or may never happen. But if I'm waiting for something to go wrong, there's no way I'll go to deep sleep. And that's where things like journaling are coming in. That's where, meditation as an intervention. I've got to clear that cognitive inbox and create a sense of total peace. Again, chemical influences aside, before I'm going to be able to go to a sleep where I'm vulnerable from a predator attack. That won't happen. People don't sleep well in hotel rooms. Again, all these sort of things. Again, if there's any chance that I'll be exposed from a risk point of view overnight, I can't go to deep sleep. It's just counterintuitive. So sleep is a foundation of the actions from the minute we wake up to the ones we go to bed. That is our biggest opportunity. I also restore energy when I'm balancing my internal nervous system state. And you raised the phrase parasympathetic earlier, which is one branch of what we call the autonomic nervous system. So I've got this biological system in me now that's determining if my body is ready for threat, and it will prime me internally, heart rate up, sugar up, blood pressure up, or I'm ready for digestion and energy restoration, heart rate lower, blood pressure lower, blood in my stomach, not in my muscles. And everybody every day is moving their internal physiology between slightly more ready for threat and slightly more ready for recovery. And which system I choose will be on which system I prime. Right? So if Sam comes in here with a whole load of cookies, I smell them, I'm grateful for them. I prime my digestive system because I've had a very clear visual cue I'm about to eat. If someone runs in here now with a machete, I'm primed to deal with that. And I can see someone coming in with cakes as a machete, and I could see someone coming in with a machete as cake. So the environment matters, but how I perceive the environment determines what my physiology gets ready for. Right? And what you've got there is the more things I see that I've got to be low grade ready for threat, the more I disable my ability to go into that energy restorative system, parasympathetic tone. And again, using big sound bites to solve much more complicated problems, it'd be fair to say modern day health is very intertwined with an absence of sufficient time spent in parasympathetic tone. Yeah. Like the modern person is not overstressed, they're physiologically under-relaxed. And the outcome of those two things is exactly the same. Slightly higher blood pressure, slightly worse digestive capability, slightly disengaged deep sleep, etc. So Sam's getting 3 hours sleep a night. He may well make up some of that energy through condensed pockets of parasympathetic tone, which could be something as simple as meditation would do that. And some effective Vedic meditation, so like transcendental meditation, 2 blocks of 20 minutes can look physiologically like 8 hours of restorative sleep. Breath work will give me condensed pockets of energy restoration. Mindful, conscious eating again enables that type of inflection. So it might be that through other habits and behaviors, you compensate for your lack of sleep, or the lack of sleep creates that fatigue, or the lack of parasympathetic creates that fatigue, and we don't listen to that symptom, like going to the doctors, and we go, right, then I'll caffeinate it, I'll train over it, I will continue to create energizing situations to blast the signal into oblivion. And then you're into energy debt. And that is the question of how long I can pay that debt down and how deep the reservoir of reserve is. So, poor sleep plus poor time over 24 hours spent in parasympathetic tone, plus minus, not being able to turn off inflammation. Inflammation's a podcast on itself, but it's a low-grade immune reaction. So localized inflammation, you'd give me savage leg day, and I deliberately didn't bring my kit here today. I won't be able to walk down the stairs tomorrow. Delayed onset muscle soreness, 24, 48 hours. That's very much a localized inflammation. Systemic or chronic inflammation is more of a sort of low-grade immune reaction going on around all the cells of the body. So it's not as obvious as swelling or edema or et cetera. But it's triggered by inadequate time in physiological recovery. It's triggered by high glucose diet. It's triggered by poor sleep. So it's sort of intertwined with the first two, but it's dependent on omega-3, vitamin D, availability of anti-inflammatory components like curcumin, the ingredient in turmeric, that sort of thing. So there's nutritional piece over here, plus commitment to quality sleep, plus commitment to quality rest and recovery. And this is where we see logic for why such companies like Headspace and Calm that are billion-dollar tech companies, because they put a product in the marketplace that exactly solves what was a societal problem is that we've become hyper vigilant, continually switched on. Everything's telling you to check this, do that, think about that, forecast that, be ready. You're living in the now, the past, the future. It's an incredible time to be alive. It's no more stressful than it's ever been, but it's more information being, cast into my landscape than ever before. And so that environment just disengages my ability to switch off. And that first problem of society ripples into parasympathetic tone, absent sleep quality, absent inflammation ability to turn off, absent. And I, from my clinical experience, absence of recovery was probably the biggest single common denominator in everyone I saw, because you'll know, again, with high-performing people, they probably train quite well and they probably control their nourishment pretty well. But they think that buys them a ticket to get away with crap sleep, crap recovery, crap anti-inflammatory, and they buffer the fatigability associated with their lifestyle through products and services. And then you end up down the line and they go, oh, I got this illness. And you're like, well, why would you not have got that illness? This recovery is your immune system. This recovery is your cognitive clarity. This recovery is the energy you needed to deal with those early cancer cells, and you completely turned it off because you were taking a marker of success as performance, not as how I felt and that well-being, happiness piece we started with.
Yeah. Where does sleep is the big one, and you've touched on caffeine, alcohol, and things. But where does ice baths and infrared saunas sit within this?
Good question. So so ice baths are really interesting because of course my response if I fall into cold on a pure physiological level
is parasympathetic.
Yeah, spot on. So it's going to preserve my life. So the body never knows that you're controlled to jump in your ice bath. It thinks you've fallen out of a boat into the Arctic. So it's all right. How do I keep Ollie alive? Whenever I say Ollie, I'm talking about you. I'm not a narcissist. Talking about myself. The Ollie. I've got to survive till the lifeboat gets me. So I've got to centralize all my resources, slow my metabolic rate, and reduce my expenditure of heat. So I will, vagal tones. A vagus nerve is the nerve that's the architect of the parasympathetic tone. So when people talk about stimulates the vagal nerve, or this is vagally stimulating, they're talking about how do I move my physiology from energy out, alert, sympathetic, fight or flight into rest and digest. So the vagal tone is really the messenger of that. It's not a thing itself. It's just it's a way of enabling more parasympathetic tone. So you'll get a parasympathetic response there and then, and that sort of a bit like, not dissimilar if I just put you into slow breathing. So if I recognize that there's a different autonomic nervous system response between inhalation, where I get an increase in sympathetic drive, and exhalation, where I get an increase in parasympathetic. If I look at most traditional breathing techniques, if I extend the exhalation beyond the inhalation periods, if you and I both breathe in for 4, breathe out for 6, over a period of time, I will drive parasympathetic tone. Yeah. And I can take iterations of that where I do breath holds to increase carbon dioxide, and box breathing and other techniques people hear about. But, there are quick ways of modulating me out of that system. Breath and cold are 2 instant ones that work quite well. Cold also has a localized effect, which is, in the field of great debate, and how much it suppresses post-exercise damage. So it reduces inflammation. But you and I both know we want inflammation, because I ripped my legs to pieces doing squats because I want bigger legs in 2 days' time, or stronger legs. So I don't want to kill the chemical messenger of change. And that's where ice baths have got confused in the context of training and development, and the fact everyone saw Andy Murray doing an ice bath after Wimbledon because he doesn't want to get fitter from the 5-set match he played. He wants to play again in a day or 2 days. So if Andy Murray wanted to get fitter, he wouldn't necessarily have done an ice bath straight away, because he would enable proper rest and recovery, and 2 days later come back with the developed version of himself. If he wants to say, I want to play and compete at the same level tomorrow, I've got to suppress that inflammatory response. Yeah. And the science on that, I'm not going to profess to being at the bleeding edge of it, but, I think there's mixed debate on what the frequency, timing, and dosage is from not suppressing my gains and allowing repeat exertion. So if I've got a 2-day high rocks competition, I want to do it after day 1 for sure, because I want to enable myself. If I'm periodizing towards it, I wouldn't know exactly when the right dosage would be. So there's the localized quelling of inflammation, but we've got to be careful we don't kill the messenger that we wanted, because that's why I train. Training isn't good for me. Training is damage, and then reflection on that damage, and then physical adaptation. So the same thing damages me less. in the future. The body doesn't know what sport is, it doesn't know what training is. All it knows is you've created what it thinks is an environment that it's now got to work harder to survive in. So when you do an incredible deadlift, it thinks, oh my God, why is he taking so many bags of groceries back home to the tribe? I'll better put on, stronger glutes, stronger, erector spinae, whatever it might be. So that's an interesting piece. The other benefit is, of course, controlled dosage of stress to build psychological resilience. And that's where the biggest probably logic stems in. I think there's an awful lot of stress for people anyway, but giving yourself this controlled dosage and showing yourself anything's possible as part of the mindset piece is really interesting. So I think it's a micro dose of parasympathetic tone. Strategically, it can play a role in energy restoration, and it can be a very good way of building mental grit and resilience. Saunas are slightly different. In fact, if you go in a sauna, you'll see an elevated heart rate response, elevated blood pressure, so you'll see a sympathetic reaction. Now, the question there in terms of modality, infrared is heating you from the inside out, so it's like a vibration-based heating, so you might get a good quality thermal effect from 55, 60 degrees, whereas if I go to a Finnish or Swedish sauna, I need 80, 85, 90 degrees if I'm punching it out. So that's heating me externally and will elicit a much greater cardiovascular response. So the Finnish sauna study showed that 2 to 3, I think it was 3 saunas a week, reduced risk of cardiovascular disease by something more than 20%. And the great debate there, for those who engage in things like Huberman podcast and other is that mechanism because of these things called heat shock proteins? Is it because of some enormous intracellular benefit? Or is it the fact that when I'm in that sauna for 20 minutes, my heart rate looks like I'm on a bike? And no one could distinguish the mechanism of longevity? Or is it, and they've been pretty good with this, that people who do sauna 3 times a week also train, look after their diet, and there's no single factor that determines illness or wellness with human physiology, but saunas unequivocally are good for us. If you wear something like a heart rate variability monitor or a monitor of autonomic tone, and that's what those devices do, what you'll see a spike of stress when you stress, when you do the sauna, and then what you'll see is increased recovery afterwards. And that's the same with exercise. If I exercise effectively, the exercise is a stress, but the post-exercise is recovery. And then my recovery baseline moves up each day, which will be visible through something like a resting heart rate. So when people go, oh, my resting heart rate went from 60, now it's 50, now it's 45. That's not because their heart has got that much bigger. There'll be growth of the heart, but it's because the vagal tone is greater because the stresses they put onto their body has enabled a higher dosage of parasympathetic as baseline. Long way around, think of ice bath as a controlled way of coming out of stress. A sauna is a controlled stress that has a longevity benefit in reducing stress the following day and the day after, plus a really effective way of post-exercise, cool down, plus potential longevity benefit through a number of mechanisms that are sort of straw man at the moment.
Nice. You mentioned HRV. It's a measurement of, I guess, readiness.
Yes.
That's a biggie, right, in this area? The increase in whoops, aura rings, things like that.
Yep.
For people that don't have them, should they get them? What should we think about with HRV?
I think it's a beautiful parameter. I think HRV, so heart rate variability, is saying, look, Ollie, if you've got a heart rate of 60 beats per minute, it doesn't beat once per second. So people get confused between heart rate variability and arrhythmia, which is an irregular heartbeat. So everyone's heartbeat should be regularly irregular, or should have a sort of format to it, in the fact that the beats between heartbeats should change quite dramatically. So one's 1 second, next 1.2, then it's 0.8 seconds. And that variability tells me basically which nervous system is running my heart. So from a very simple point of view, if the sympathetic nervous system is running my body, my heart rate will be more metronomical, boom, boom, on the beat. If my heart and biological system is being controlled by parasympathetic, it'll be a much more erratic pattern because the way the parasympathetic affects the heart is directly, whereas the sympathetic affects through chemicals without overkilling it. So what's always first counterintuitive about HRV is higher is better until it's too high. And here we end up with the sweet spot of you will not be able to compare your heart rate variability with mine and determine who is healthier. We can compare your heart rate variability with you and determine change. But there's a real difficulty that, unlike VO2 match, which I can say if yours is 60 and mine's 45, you're unequivocally fitter. If your HRV measured by a mathematical interpretation of that beat to beat variance is 120 and mine's 70, that doesn't mean you're better than me. Probably are better than me. But principally, that makes it a really difficult parameter for people to get their head around. And that's where Whoop or every other technology provider have got their own algorithm to understand how they're going to communicate that to the end user in a way that's normally referenced against themselves. That's why most of the kits take 2 or 3 days to calibrate, because they're trying to work out what your baseline heart rate variability is and then work out when you're above it, which would be, again, when we've got less heart rate variability, that's you moving into sympathetic drive. When you've got more heart rate variability, that's you moving into parasympathetic. So heart rate variability, is basically a shop window to look at your autonomic nervous system. So as a thing, it's not really a thing. It's like, I measure VO2 max by getting on the bike, but I want the VO2 max. I want the result. And the result of readiness is really saying one of two things. There has been too much time spent in sympathetic drive, and your body is not ready now to take on more load because it hasn't really gone into recovery. Or if they're intelligent, you've got too much recovery going on, which means you're still recovering. So when you find people in states of potential fatigue, you sometimes find them as having too much parasympathetic because their body is basically stuck. So if I measure someone who's got a cold or a flu, you might see huge parasympathetic afterwards because their body is recovering. So they're not ready to take on load. Whereas you look at their aura and go, hang on, this guy's ready to tear it up. But no, they're still in recovery. So at the moment, those devices don't know what's happening in your life. They're trying to work that out and they're trying to calibrate. So they want you to fill in the diary. So they're building their master database of, this is the average response to caffeine, this average response to alcohol, average response to watching, Dharma on Netflix. And, they'll build that algorithm and they're all worth billions anyway, but they'll sell it, when it's primed. The question is, the data itself without the context is still not good enough. So, and the data, again, without context, doesn't know what you need to achieve. So I was wearing my Whoop when I was training for a very disappointing marathon this year. I will play, against the man I used to be. But, I was happy with the end result of it. But I'm using it and it's like, I've got to do my long run on a Sunday, right? And again, circumstances of work, children mean that's my window. My Whoop saying I'm not ready to do it. I've got no choice, right? So I have to override it. And actually, some of the days I had my best runs was where the Whoop told me I shouldn't run. So how does that work? It's an extra piece of information for informed decision making, but it's not yet prescriptive enough to know me better than the situation I find myself in and subjectively how I feel. And what it really is saying, is there too little parasympathetic or is there too much parasympathetic? And in those situations, you should consider a reduction in training intensity and volume because your body may not be able to take on load. And you might say, again, I've got high rocks in a week. I have to, and I'm 23 and I don't care because my body will get through that. Or you could say, oh God, I've got a board level presentation next week. If I do this and get it wrong, my immune system falls off a cliff. I get that chest infection I always get, and I'm going to listen to it. Yeah. And that's where I think the modern coach plus that data should be crucial. And I find it interesting, none of those tech have come through the coach as their conduit. They've gone direct to consumer. Everyone's gone to the consumer because maybe they don't trust the fitness professional, maybe the fitness professional hasn't put its hand up. But Whoop plus coach is really useful. Whoop direct to consumer can be as confusing as it is valuable.
Yeah, I've always found them really great calibration tools for periods of my life where I can potentially create some order and routine to fix a problem. Yeah. But then once I'm in the flow of life and shit just needs to get done, it kind of will go out the window. But I think they have great utility in periods of life, particularly those that aren't necessarily aware or that are trying to give some validation to changing lifestyle factors like sleep and like training and like recovery.
100%. I think that is the perfect description. Calibration, to validate actions. My wife at the moment, I put a continuous glucose monitor on so we can understand how intermittent fasting affects her from a mood point of view. She's moody as she won't be listening to
running a test on your wife.
I literally snuck up on her, stuck the monitor on. It's very ethically dubious, and fundamentally to go to her, you're able to function from a you may feel symptomatic. Hunger is not just driven by your glucose control, but if your glucose control is stable and you can run fasting, then it's a bit more willpower required. And again, that simplifies. But that'll be 2 weeks and then done. She's not going to make every decision for the rest of her life based on what the glucose monitor is saying. So you calibrate. I'm not wearing the Whoop now because at the moment I understand the repercussion of all the things I do. I've calibrated to know if I drink alcohol tomorrow, I won't be able to do a hard run. If I've had a hell of a day, I won't do a high session that evening and I might leave it the next day. I've built that framework with data, but now why would I need that data? It becomes a yoke around my neck in the absence of a specific purpose.
We've touched on so many things and we could touch on a lot more and probably go into a lot more depth. I want to do one final, because you mentioned it, intermittent fasting.
Yeah.
Because I know there's been reported, huge benefits reported, but it's not for everyone. And some people use it as a great tactic, more so probably for weight management than the other benefits. But can you give us the cliff notes on intermittent fasting, why you would do it, when you would do it, and who might find most beneficial?
And I can do it from, again, there'll be better clinical nutritionists than I who could surmise it. I think in my experience, it's a very effective way of controlling total calories in. So, it's very difficult. And again, intermittent fasting or time restricted feeding, the method I'm most familiar with is the 16-8, where you're saying, like, I'm going to eat all my calories that contribute to, to energy production within an 8-hour window. And then for 16 hours, try and avoid anything but water and herbal teas. That's sort of the window. First thing first is, someone with an eating disorder, that may not work. You've got to be really careful with people's relationship with food. So as a panacea, nothing works nutritionally. But if someone has a difficult relationship with food and they're starting to see that food is a punishment and the absence from it, that could be a problem. So I think there's an emotional piece. There's a triage piece that says, look, if you've got a good relationship with food and you just want to find a more lifestyle efficient methodology of eating well all the time, I think it can work really well. So its first benefit is it's unlikely that between those 8 hours, which is likely 2 meals, you'll eat the same volume of calories as you'd eat over a 12, 14, 15 hour window. So that discipline works well. The principal benefit where most things nutritionally hinge is between this debate of calories and glucose control. So we touched on glucose control already. I've got a certain level of sugar in my blood, and really the logical science is I don't want that sugar going too high and I don't want that sugar going too low, and that will contribute to my cognitive clarity. That will contribute to my weight management because high glucose can be stored as fat tissue. It contributes to my inflammatory state because high glucose again can create inflammation. So avoiding these spikes or rises in glucose is a major lifestyle strategy for most things. That's where, again, fiber's amazing, movement's amazing. But I think, from a glucose point of view, people are interested in increased insulin sensitivity with time away from eating. And that's a proposed benefit, that if I don't eat as frequently, my body's ability to be sensitive to the hormone that takes glucose down, which is insulin, is enhanced. And that would be a major reason in the longevity camp that it gets credibility. So the drug metformin does exactly that, makes my cells more receptive to insulin. Doesn't change anything else fundamentally. So what you've got is maybe less calories, maybe an increased sensitivity to glucose. There's an argument from the gut that it benefits from time away from eating from an inflammatory point of view. Digestion is a active metabolic process, and time away from digestion fits more with ancestral habits and behaviors of feast and famine to a degree. So gut microbiome, I think some studies have shown, others have been equivocal, that the gut bacterial picture benefits from periods away from eating. And again, just from a sheer accessibility of life perspective, it's a framework that takes pressure off having to find 3 meals of nourishing quality. Can you do it in 2? So within those 2 meals, did I get across the week my 20, 30 different plants? Did I get my X number of grams of protein per kilogram? Did I get my 30 grams of fiber? I still have to nourish myself. But what I would say is, for someone who's looking to control mass, and again, your mass will be determined, which mass you lose depends how much weight training you're doing and the stage of life. It's an effective lifestyle tool that probably benefits the gut, probably benefits blood glucose control, certainly helps control calories, but you need the right mindset to make sure it doesn't, again, create a difficult relationship with food.
That's brilliant. I think having done intermittent fasting and maybe do it again in the future, all these sort of tactics are things that people should just try if they feel as though what they're currently doing isn't working, and if they feel there's a better option, these are just tools that they can bring into their life and give a go for a period of time. I knew we were going to touch on a lot of things, but I think we've done an incredible job of unpacking. I mean, movement and nutrition being the first two, but unpacking some of the bits that I think are being rammed down people's throats through social media. We're becoming more aware of them and just bringing in strategies that we can actually apply to get a desired outcome. So, Ollie, that has been epic. Where can we hear more from you and about you? Because I'm someone that follows a lot of your journey through social media, and I've been to a lot of your talks as well. So just give the listeners a quick understanding of where can they go to find out more?
It's a good question. I'm not as good on social media as
I'm
getting there. So I've got, I think, clinical_wellbeing. I should know that off that. Yeah, is my sort of professional account. I've got, if you search me, you'll find Wellbeing Dad, which is me trying to be a good dad and not sort of a weirdo, juicing the kids breakfast type dad, but, leading a balanced life in a deployable way. But clinical wellbeing, experimenting on my wife, that's on both accounts, I think. So I think clinical wellbeing is my most common place people can find me. We touched on, created future practice as really to say what is the skills I think are absent from the fitness and lifestyle industry that will elevate coaches quickest.
I think this one's a brilliant one. Having been someone that obviously works in the education space with personal trainers and gym owners, and just seeing the skill gap or the information, the expertise gap. And a lot of coaches are looking to upskill themselves as it relates to movement and as it relates to nutrition. But this one I think is a really good one, because a lot of the people that present themselves in our gyms could just do with better recovery, better stress management, better lifestyle practices. So just give us a quick insight on future practice.
Right, and it's exactly that. Saying, look, you know when you've coached for a while that you can't get there through those two domains alone. So I was like, well, for me, the biggest area of technical understanding that is missing from the fitness industry that makes a massive difference to every client was this concept around recovery and how I can have a fair dialogue around it without overstepping my boundaries. So Future Practice created an accredited SimSpa, not that many people care about that, but digitally deliverable course. It's 9 hours on practical stress resilience coaching, which has 3 outcomes really. First outcome is that you add quality sleep, stress, and recovery advice to your toolkit. Secondly, you'd be able to add in, if you wanted, technical measurements like heart rate variability and cortisol melatonin testing, if that's an interesting area. And I don't advocate for that, but I do enable it. And the third area is this is the sweet spot for organizational, information, right? So by someone walked into the gym, they're probably pretty health literate. They already recognize the need for movement, recognize the need for nutrition. Those talks don't go well in offices because no one wants to hear fit people talking about movement and exercise. When I go to offices, and do corporate well-being talks, wherever it may be, I talk about stress, sleep, recovery, and energy. And that gets, my hand gets bitten off. And I go, oh, by the way, the biggest single factor affecting this will be your movement. And they're like, oh, do I need to weight train? Do I need to do cardio? And I was like, yeah, you absolutely do. But no one's ever framed it as that benefit. And so, my only superpower is I spend my life with people who aren't in gyms and aren't clinically unwell. So, by thousands of health assessments, I spend my life with normal people, not that either of those populations are abnormal, but, gen pop. Yeah, but and again, fit people already have a degree of literacy. I think they need recovery critically, but gen pop needs recovery critically. And movement is the gateway to all things physiological, but recovery is the conversation that enables you to get to movement. Yeah. And so 60% of the UK's got a sleep problem. Now, where do they go? Right? They might read Matthew Walker While We Sleep. They might self-solve, but someone going through a relatively systematic way of going, look, let's control wake and sleep time. Let's control a bit of light. Let's deal with caffeine. Let's deal with alcohol. That should be a conversation every good coach is having. But they should also know, oh crap, this is a bit too much for me. I'm going to refer you back. So creating a scope of practice that your average, to elite fitness professional can add stress, sleep, recovery to their toolkit. That's what Future Practice does as a digital course. And continuing to give people skills that we can step into this weird space, which is not fitness, but is well-being in a consistent narrative with a good scope of practice, integrating products. There is no well-being professional. And fitness, if you understand fitness and nutrition, you're 60% of that well-being professional. And that's, when someone's coming in from a life coaching point of view, there might be 30%. Someone coming from nutrition, there might be 40%. Fitness is the right person to become the well-being professional, but it has got to have at least equal competency in recovery as it does in movement and nutrition prescribing. And that's my passion project. And that's what Future Practice, which is at futurepractice_ or www.futurepractice.org, where there's the course where people can try the first 6 modules and then buy it if they like it.
Yeah, brilliant. That's a big plug and one that I think all coaches and personal trainers should definitely go and check out.
Thank you.
That was a beast. Ollie Patrick, thank you very much, mate.
Absolute pleasure. Great questions.
Cheers, mate.
Thanks, pal.